2 weeks ago, we started looking at ancient non-Christian writers who may have mentioned or who did mention Christ in their writings. We looked at Tacitus 2 weeks ago. Then last week we looked at Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, or Suetonius, other than the fact that he was chief secretary of the Emperor Hadrian around AD 117, sometime between 180, 117 to AD 138. Very little is known of him. Two mentions, or possible mentions. One was in the life of Claudius, in which he referred to the banishing of from Rome of all the Jews. And of course, it was said it was at the instigation of one Chrestus. Now you run into, as we said, you run into those who would say that this Chrestus was not Jesus. There are those who would say that this Chrestus is just a misspelling of Christus. Well, we'll go ahead, we'll accept the second, but it is interesting to note that this writing confirms what we find in the book of Acts, chapter 18, does it not? Because we note that Luke wrote, well, how did Paul meet Aquila and Priscilla? Well, they came from Rome. Well, why were they then in Corinth? Well, Luke didn't leave it unannounced, did he? He didn't keep silent about it. He said, why? Because they had been commanded as Jews, and if we talked about this, I think we've talked about this in the past. Were they Christians when they met Paul? We don't know. It would seem to me that if they were not, their conversion would have been mentioned by Luke. But of course, in the eyes of the Roman authorities, at this time, who were Christians? What was Christianity? A sect of the Jews. It was just some offshoot of the Jews, some group of the Jews. And so, as we said, they would have run, if you were Jewish, we're going to run you out. Whether you are a Pharisee, a Sadducee, an Essene, a Christian, we're going to run you out. Now, this instigation, we point out, if it was, it could have been by a man by the name of Christus that caused a lot of problems. But it could have also been based upon the teachings of Christ, which we note in the book of Acts. What happens many a time when Paul preaches the gospel? Trouble occurs. And who really instigates this trouble? A lot of times it's the Jews. And so, for example, Acts chapter 18, verse 12, I referenced it last week. Let's just briefly read it. And when Gallio was deputy of Achaia, again, here is Luke giving detail. Just didn't say he brought him up before the court, brought him up before the council. He gives a name. He gives a name. The Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, and I just find this, I always find this as humorous, just because, before you can say anything, it's, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it was a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O you Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names, and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. Basically meaning this is an internal matter between you Jews, deal with it. It's not part of the court. And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then this is another part that I just really find interesting. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of those things. I can't speak for certain, but it appears that Gallio may have had some bias against the Jews. May not have been, I guess today he would be called anti-Semitic, maybe. But I also just find it interesting that these Greeks, it doesn't say they were Greek Christians, does it? It just says the Greeks. You're wasting our time. You're wasting the court's time. We're going to show you. But again, why was Paul brought up before Gallio? Because the Jews, and they had stoned them, they had persecuted them. It is not impossible to imagine that the teaching in Rome was done in such a way that it did cause problems of a physical nature. And Claudius says, goodbye. Well, if you're Jewish, get out. So, not impossible. Then the second thing he mentioned was, under the rule of life of Nero, he talks a little bit about some of the things. Tacitus was very detailed in some of the things that happened, if you remember. Suetonius was a little was more subdued, you might say. He likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, a sort of people who held a new and impious superstition. And so we note, you compare what Tacitus says. Again, Sidonius is a little more subdued, is he not? Doesn't bring out the dirty laundry, so to speak. But there were punishments. And so we pointed out that what we note is that there was a group of Christians. Again, we point out the expulsion from Rome ties in from what Luke wrote in Acts chapter 18, that there were disturbances in Rome. The church was in Rome. Note that how was the church in Rome at the time of Claudius' disbursement? Paul hadn't been there. No matter what the Catholics say, Peter hadn't been there. So how did the church get to Rome if the Christians were in Rome at this time?
Is it sort of like what the Jews experienced, the Jewish dispersion?
Well, if you go back to Acts chapter 2, who was present? What was one of the groups that were present at the day of Pentecost? There were those from Rome. And so at some point when, maybe before Paul's persecution, but definitely after that persecution, what probably happened? Those people finally went home, or they may have been going home before, and that's the church. Again, one of the reasons why we note that this group, though, that had left, was still there, had not had an apostle be there, because Paul, of course, he wanted to bestow gifts upon them. Peter had been there to establish it. Peter could have done that. But we find this, so that the church was in Rome, Christians were in Rome. How did Suetonius review Christianity? An impious, a mischievous superstition. So he didn't really hold Christianity in favorable terms, did he? Mischievous. That doesn't necessarily mean bad, I guess, but when we're thinking about serving a God, do we really want mischievous to be the term we use for our religion? No, we don't. Then Pliny the Younger, of course, he was the nephew and adopted son of the historian Bob the Younger. Pliny the Elder. I used that last week as well. So, author and administrator who was sent by the Roman Emperor Trajan to the region of Bithynia in AD 110 and 111. Bithynia was mentioned in Acts chapter 16. Paul wanted to go there on his second missionary journey, but he was forbidden by God, and that's before then he crossed over the Aegean to go into Macedonia, on the Macedonian call to go into Greece and Macedonia. Known for his books of letters, portions of 10 of his books, all the portions have survived. We read last week good detail, good part of this, so we won't do that again. We do note, though, that in this writing that he wrote, points out that this Christ, their founder, this man, was worshipped as deity by the early believers. They referred to as debased, contagious superstition, excessive superstition. Point out things that they would not do. They would make statements of this: commit adultery, rob, steal, etc. There may have been some reference to the love feast that was mentioned, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. That could tie into the Lord's Supper. We won't say that for certain. Did appear that they met on a standard day, a set day, so that would, in all likelihood, would be the Lord's Day, the first day of the week. Met before dawn. Why would they have done that? Probably because they had to go to work. Probably because they had to, again, when we think of the Roman Empire and we think of Rome, slavery needs to be thought of. It was not a bustling city of a bunch of free people. It was a city of a lot of slaves and some leaders. A few free men, a few citizens, and a lot of slaves. Pointed out that this persecution that was occurring, or when they questioned him, some would deny, but he called those who were true believers would not deny the Christ, nor would they worship any of the gods, nor would they worship the emperor. Reference the singing of hymns as well. Just briefly, the letter 97 is Trajan's reply, which we didn't read, but let me just briefly read what we've got here. You have adopted the proper course, my dear Pliny, in examining the cases of those who've been denounced to you as Christians. Notice that word, denounced. What does that really give you that idea? I denounce so-and-so as a kind, loving individual. I think when I was, my English teacher in high school or middle school would have said, I don't think you used the right verb there. Would you? Denounce implies what?
You have disfavor.
Out of favor, there's something wrong here. You're denounced as a heretic. That's not a good thing. So, in Trajan's eyes, if you were denounced as a Christian, that's not a good thing, you know. For no hard and fast rule can be laid down to meet a question of such wide extent. These Christians are not to be hunted out. If they are brought before you and the offense is proved, they are to be punished, but with this reservation, that if anyone denies that he's a Christian and makes it clear that he is not, by offering prayers to our deities, then he is to be pardoned because of his recantation, however suspicious his past conduct may be. But pamphlets published anonymously must not carry any weight whatever, no matter what the charge may be, for they are not only a precedent of the very worst type, but they are not in consonance with the spirit of our age. So, if you were accused as a Christian, and you were willing to denounce your Christianity and pray to the deities, the Greek Roman deities, you could be pardoned. But notice it says these published anonymously, pamphlets published anonymously. What does that sort of say? Your accusation has to be what? So substantiated. Someone just couldn't write a letter and say, Ricardo is a Christian. There had to be someone's name signed, there had to be evidences offered. And so, in one sense, that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? Not that they're persecuting Christians, but the idea is just because someone writes a letter and says, hey, signed anonymous, Ricardo's a Christian, you need to punish him, that's, what's the evidence, So he's doing that. Okay. So a few that we'll look at that are not found in the Apologetics Press article in our Bible, although if you go online and pull up an article based upon this first one is listed. Celsus, not Celsius, Celsus. He was a pagan philosopher who wrote the True Discourse in AD 178. Apparently, it was a vehement attack upon Christianity. But the reason I say apparently is because how do we know that it existed? Well, there are no copies that exist. But where do we find proof of its existence? In Origen's Contra Celsus, Latin for against Celsus, which is a writing, some 70 or 80 years after the writing, but he writes this against this, and in Origen's writing, he is referencing points that Celsus makes, and then he would argue against those points. So interestingly, Celsus's writing is known. Why? Because of a patristic, a Christian writer in the early church, or an early church writer. So, says something there. The virgin birth. Let us imagine what a Jew, let alone a philosopher, might say to Jesus. Is it not true, good sir, that you fabricated the story of your birth from a virgin to quiet rumors about the true and unsavory circumstances of your origin? Is it not the case that far from being born in the royal David city of Bethlehem, you were born in a poor country town and of a woman who earned her living by spinning? Is it not the case that when her deceit was uncovered, to wit, that she was pregnant by a Roman soldier called Panthera, she was driven away by her husband, the carpenter, and convicted of adultery? Then continuing on a little bit later, I could continue along these lines, suggesting a good deal about the affairs of Jesus' life that does not appear in your own records. Indeed, what I know to be the case and what the disciples tell are two very different stories. For example, the nonsensical idea that Jesus foresaw everything that was to happen to him, an obvious attempt to conceal the humiliating facts. A little bit later, the men who fabricated the genealogy of Jesus is implied, were insisting on the point that Jesus was descended from the first man and from the King of the Jews. The poor carpenter's wife seemed not to know that she had such a distinguished bunch of ancestors. What an absurdity. A little bit later, maybe a little bit earlier, clearly the Christians have used the myth of Danae and the Melanoipe and of the Augie and of the Entapio and fabricating the story of Jesus' virgin birth. And then finally, the old myths of the Greeks that attribute a divine birth to Perseus or Amphion or Aeacus and Minos are equally good evidence of their wondrous works on behalf of mankind, and certainly no less lacking in the plausibility than the stories of your followers. So what does Celsus basically write, what we have here? The account of Jesus is what? Fiction. It's made up. He was not the Messiah. He's not the Savior. He's not of royal lineage. He is just the illegitimate son of a Jewish spinster, impregnated by a Roman soldier. What? Oh, that's a good question. Since I don't have the time, did not going to read all this. I will read which Origen said a little bit about some of this. And this is a summary. Excuse me, this is not what Origen wrote. This is a summary of Origen's writing. Well, before we go there, note that the accusations made by Celsus are not the only time some of those accusations are made. We'll also note this. You'll hear this sometimes, that there are a number of accounts in various forms of mythology that sort of parallel, that are just like Jesus Christ, making it sound like they're exactly the same thing. Then once you start digging into it, what do you find? Well, it's sort of like, well, you know, the Babylonians have a flood account. And then we talked about that a couple years ago, remember? And when you started read it and studied, what did you discover? There was nothing except for the fact that there was some kind of box and there was some destruction, some order. It was not the same, was it? And that's what happens in a lot of these accounts here. I find that this man, we've got mythologies where a man was the son of a god, and yet then when you read the account, is it the same thing that what we read about Jesus? No. Again, Hercules was a son of a god. And yet compare Hercules to Jesus Christ. In fact, what Bible character would we probably compare Hercules to? If we were going to compare a Bible character, I'd say Samson. I'd say Samson, just because of his strength and his arrogance and some of that. Hercules was an arrogant person. So, you read Samson, he was very, as we was telling the young men Sunday morning, he played with fire, did he not? He did some things he shouldn't have. But there's Hercules, just because he's the son of Jupiter or Zeus, does that make him the same as Jesus Christ? And we could look at some of these other myths and you'd see, you note significant differences there as well. But a summary that was written about origins right on this is this. The principal charges brought by Celsus against Christianity were as follows. The Christians were members of illegal secret associations which were necessary to them because they would suffer death if their practices were known. The origins of Christianity were derived from secondary sources, some of these even barbarous, and Moses himself simply borrowed the ordinances which he promulgated. And that's an accusation that gets made, and of course, Moses, where would he have borrowed? Let's just say if Moses was supposed to borrow something, from whom would he have likely borrowed? What group was he associated with for the first 40 years of his life? Talk about Moses. The Egyptians. And yet when we go to the law of Moses and we look at some of the things that were done medically, and then you read about what the Egyptians were doing, if Moses had borrowed from the Egyptians things that were done medically, you'd have seen a totally different law of Moses. In fact, that's the thing. Moses did not borrow a lot of things from the Egyptians from whom he was associated. The alleged divinity of Jesus cannot be proved from his miracles, since they were the mere tricks of a juggler, while the indications of his life and character are equally against the doctrine. Jewish converts to Christianity were ipso facto renegades, since the new religion was no improvement upon the old. Both the Jewish and the Christian religions were really rebellious against the state. The alleged theophanies were really the appearances of demons, and the Christian eschatology is irrational and incredible. Okay, so he makes a lot of comments, and we don't have the time to go over some of that. That's not really the purpose. But we could see why, even though it's 70 or 80 years later, some think that it's because Rome was approaching its 1,000th year in existence that Origen did this, because he thought that writing like this might come up. And so he went, I don't know why Origen picked something 70 years or 80 years later, but he did. But we can see, let's note this. Apologetics is not a 20th century invention. Apologetics is not a 21st century invention. Apologetics has been around, defending the faith has been around since the start of the church. But note his divinity, he performed these miracles. Well, they were tricks. There must have been a lot of deceit then based upon some of the things that were said, we acknowledge today there are people who say they heal. They heal people, and yet we know when you dig into it, my all-time, or they can raise the dead. My all-time favorite is you got the preacher, the Church of Christ preacher, I think it was in the 40s, got arrested because supposedly there was going to be a raising of the dead, and so people were allowed to come and view the body. And as he viewed the body, he took a hairpin, and rammed it into, and guess what happened to that body? The pin was miraculous because that body jumped up and screamed. The preacher, though, was arrested for disturbing the peace or something like that. Of course, my favorite on the variance is the police officer who said, let's make certain. And he pulled out his pistol, and whether this is true or not, but this really would sound good. Pulled out his pistol, 2 or 3 bullets, and it won't matter, will it? He's dead already. This will just improve. And supposedly then that body arose as well. So, maybe that gun was a miracle, miraculous. So. But these kind of statements are not unknown tricksters. And of course, we note that in the book of Acts, there's some reference to that with regard to Acts chapter 8, not talking about Jesus' miracles, but what? The works of Philip. Philip was doing things. Simon the sorcerer did amazing things. But what happened? Simon the sorcerer noted what? That what Philip was doing was not what Simon was doing, because Simon was a trickster. Simon was a faker. Simon was a magician. Philip was actually doing things that were real. So, but we note this. Even though he disparages Christianity, even though he talks about Jesus' birth and how it wasn't like you find in the Bible, the New Testament, what does he not do, though? In fact, based upon what he writes, how is he writing this? Like he's a real man, is he not? He didn't say Jesus doesn't exist. He's saying Jesus lied about his background. That's right. He lied about his background. He was a trickster. He didn't really heal people. He didn't perform these miracles. But didn't say he never existed. So even though Celsus denies the divinity of Christ, he doesn't deny Jesus as existing. And again, what's the purpose of this lesson? The historical Jesus. And so if he didn't think he existed, again, if today I was writing something about Superman, hopefully I'd make something, what would I announce, hopefully at some point? Oh, hopefully the reader would understand what? Or Star Wars fans, Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader, I'm not Han Solo. What would you hope that I, as the writer, would bring forth? You'd get the understanding. Details, but the fact that I realize they're fictional characters, that I don't think they're real. And so, again, we read what little we read, we don't see it, and there's no acknowledgement that Jesus didn't exist. He existed, but he was a charlatan. He was a fraud. He was a fake. Okay, Lucian, 2nd century Greek satirist. He spoke derisively of Jesus and the early Christians, thinking them to be gullible. We'll just want to read a couple passages from the Peregrine sections, 11 to 13. It was now he came across the priests and the scribes of the Christians in Palestine and picked up their, this word has a different meaning today, but queer creed, strange, note that. Can I tell you something? Have you ever played a game? I have a couple little games, mental games on my phone. I'm going to make this comment. Take this out. So you had to find a synonym. And so I had odd or strange, and I wrote in queer. Wasn't accepted. But then when I go over to dictionary.com or pull up my dictionary, guess what one of the definitions is? In fact, what the original meaning of that word was. It's just interesting, is it not? How we better get rid of that word and using it, you can't use that, even though that's what it meant. So queer, strange. Creed, I can tell you, he pretty soon convinced them of his superiority. Prophet, elder, ruler of the synagogue. He was everything at once, expounded the books, commented on them, wrote books himself. They took him for a god, accepted his laws, and declared him their president. Now, please note, this is the English translation. The Christians, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced their novel rights and was crucified on that account. So he acknowledges there's a group called Christians. And what does he make this? What does this statement say? Let me go back and read it. The Christians you know worship a man to this day, this distinguished personage who introduced their novel rights and was crucified on that account. So who obviously do they worship? They worship Jesus Christ. He doesn't mention him by name, but he references him in his comments, does he not? Who introduced the apostles' doctrine? It wasn't the apostles, was it? It was Christ. And who was crucified on the cross? It was Christ. So he's acknowledging it. Go down a little bit. You see these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which is so common among them. And it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver, that they are all brothers. From the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws, all this they take quite on trust, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. So what do we note from what we've read? And you can read a little bit more. This man, they worshiped a man, and we would know that him to be Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. He introduced new teachings. He was crucified for these teachings. What do these Christians, so-called Christians, when they are converted, what do they believe? That they are what? Brethren, brothers. They deny the gods of Greece and Rome. They worship the crucified man. So again, that would be Jesus. They're to live after his teachings. He referenced him as a sage. And so it somewhat gives him the same status as the Greek philosophers and the wise men. Christians were followers of this man, believed themselves to be immortal. Now, what does that really mean? Does that mean that they could say, hey, Sister Cook, take this sword and run it through me, and I won't die? That's not what they meant. And so he has somewhat of a misunderstanding of this. What would the Christians mean? What does this really mean? Their soul. They are going to live or die. Their souls will continue. Whether it's physical death, your soul will still continue. They accepted the teachings by faith. Now, he probably said trust, so he probably had what kind of idea with regard to faith? What do you think his definition of faith probably was? Going back to the idea that he also thinks that they were gullible. What kind of faith would we call that today? Blind faith. Just accept it. No evidence. Of course we know, what does the Bible refer to as faith? Faith is the evidence of things the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. It's not just something blind. It's not a leap in the dark. And they appear to have a disregard for material possessions. You can say common property. And again, we find that in Acts chapter 5, do we not? They were in Jerusalem, there was a need. What would they do? Those who had things, when a need arose, if a need arose, they would sell those things and give it to those who were in need. Then that's like make this a communal group, but it just was what we have is available in case there's a need. In a couple of other writings, he makes some other statements that Christians had sacred writings. They would which he was a 2nd century writer, so that would be in the hundreds AD. And You know, a lot of times you get that Bible didn't come into existence until around the late 300s. I think it's 383. Again, I'll miss that. But, you know, but he said they had their sacred writings, giving some impression that the New Testament was already in existence, which supports what you read in the Bible as well, does it not? Would spare no expense when something affected their community. We've already said something about that. And they did claim that they were easily taken by unscrupulous persons. And of course, throughout the New Testament, what warnings were given to the Christians? To be vigilant, to be wary, to, as John said, to try the spirits. Now, a lot of that's dealing with scriptural matters, is it not? But what could happen even then?
Jesus said we should be wise as serpents, but as gentle as doves.
That's right. And so what, you know, because, so, you know, and, you know, it is noted that there are, for example, one of the greatest places in the United States, please note, I'm not calling this group Christians, but for scams and the like, is the state of Utah. Why is that the case? Well, the state of Utah is basically a Mormon state. Now, it's not all Mormon, but it's basically, and they get together and have this, and here comes somebody in there, and he's a Mormon, and he's got some great idea, and he's a fellow Mormon. Next thing you know, he's taking them for all their money. Well, please note, Bernie Madoff, a lot of his victims were of what group of people? Bernie was a Jew, and a lot of them were Jewish charities and the like. Not all, but a lot. And again, here's Bernie Madoff, a fellow Jew. So this can happen. This can happen. And so maybe, I don't, without going into detail, I didn't read any details on this. You could see it. Jesus, again, use another example. When it came time to, with regard to the Messiah, claims of the Messiah, this is before Lucian's time, of course, but before the destruction of Jerusalem, what did Jesus say? Oh, if somebody says to be the Messiah, you listen to him. No, don't listen to him. Ignore him. Be again, vigilant. Be diligent. Be careful. And because there are people who will lie and deceive and cheat. And so you got to be careful spiritually and physically with regard to this. So, okay, so we'll stop here. Got one more. Again, this is on the scriptures. And again, that's not next week. Next week's Thanksgiving service. So it'll be December before this happens. But then we'll start looking at some of the Jewish writings with dealing with this. Thank you so much for your comments, your attention. Greatly appreciate it tonight.